What happens when engineers, driven by a state of blind panic, decide to graft the most colossal artillery piece of its era onto a chassis that can barely support its own weight? The result is not a triumph of technology, but a bizarre experiment and an asymmetric hybrid that exposed its own crews, without any protection, to the direct fire of the enemy. We reveal the technical dossier of a machine conceived as a deadly predator, but which proved to be a glass trap for the 5 men trapped inside. Why did the military command consciously decide to send soldiers into combat atop a 24-ton structure that was, in essence, a rolling powder keg, one that collapsed under the impact of even a single burst from a machine gun? Discover why this mechanical Frankenstein's monster was patched together with second-hand components from other tanks, and why, despite its fatal design flaws and a silhouette nearly 3 meters high, it remained on the front lines until the total exhaustion of all resources. From absurd renamings dictated by the highest spheres of power, to an incredible David versus Goliath duel in the ruins of Cologne, this is the true story of one of the most senseless improvisations in military history. It is a narrative where technical gigantomania, armed with a barrel 71 calibers long, collided brutally with the reality of an industry in collapse. The Polish campaign in the year 1939, followed by the lightning victories in the West, had instilled within the Wehrmacht a dangerous sense of technical invincibility. At the time, the Panzerjäger 1 light tank hunters, equipped with their obsolete 47mm cannons, seemed more than sufficient to subdue any contemporary opponent. However, this illusion of superiority was instantaneously shattered with the commencement of Operation Barbarossa. German troops found themselves face to face for the first time with Soviet steel colossi like the T-34 and the KV-1, against whose thick armour the shells of standard German guns, derisively nicknamed door knockers of the 37mm variety, simply bounced off. The situation on the Eastern Front rapidly degenerated into a logistical and tactical nightmare, as the only weapon capable of piercing these rolling fortresses was the heavy 88mm anti-aircraft gun, a towed artillery piece that was far too immobile and cumbersome for the fluid dynamics of armoured warfare. While the British Army, shackled by rigid doctrines and complex mountings, rarely utilised its own heavy anti-aircraft guns against ground targets, the Wehrmacht understood, out of sheer necessity for survival, that it had to motorise the legendary 88 to avoid being overwhelmed by the red tide. As a desperate provisional solution, engineers began mounting captured 7.62cm guns or German 75mm anti-tank guns onto hopelessly antiquated chassis, such as the Panzer II or the Czech-made 38T, giving birth to the Marder series. Yet these vehicles were merely makeshift patches. While they offered increased firepower, they frequently became rolling coffins for their crews due to their high silhouettes, an armour so thin it was virtually non-existent. Consequently, the military high command urgently demanded a specialised platform capable of carrying the formidable 88mm anti-tank gun model 43, a true ballistic monster, without relying on the agonisingly slow process of unhitching it from a tractor. In October of the year 1942, a concept was finally presented to Adolf Hitler that demonstrated the full schizophrenia of German engineering. A vehicle capable of vaporizing any Allied tank at record-breaking distances, yet structurally so fragile it could barely withstand the fire of a light machine gun. This marked the beginning of a development cycle based less on rational planning and more on the principle of raw improvisation, as engineers attempted to force the largest possible cannon onto a chassis that was already screaming at its structural load limits. The industrial realisation of this improvised concept laid bare the deep fissures within the German war economy. While the Alket firm in Berlin drafted the construction blueprints, serial production was transferred to the Deutsche Eisenwerke facilities in Teplitz-Schönau, located in Bohemia. There, in February of the year 1943, a frantic race against the clock began, dictated by a military command obsessed with the projected summer offensive in the east. They issued unrealistic production targets. 100 operational vehicles were to be completed by May, a demand doomed from the outset due to chronic shortages of engines and transmissions. The chassis itself was supplied by the steelworks in Duisburg, while the armour plates arrived from the Wittkowitz works, creating a logistical patchwork that massively delayed the completion of the first series, delivering only 85 units to the troops by the end of June. A closer inspection of the components used reveals that this was no homogeneous innovation, but a highly complex puzzle assembled from the leftovers of tank production. Early models of this tank hunter rolled on drive sprockets originally designed for the Panzerkampfwagen 3 USV, while the return rollers and road wheels were borrowed from the Panzerkampfwagen 4 AUSF-R. This mechanical medley posed formidable challenges to maintenance teams at the front, who were forced to stockpile spare parts for two entirely different tank types simultaneously. Later series did receive the reinforced drive sprockets of the AUSF-J, but these constant changes during ongoing production made it nearly impossible to maintain a uniform standard within units, further undermining an already strained logistical supply chain. The heart of this rolling weapon platform, the 88mm PaK 43/41 anti-tank gun, was likewise a technical compromise, albeit a lethal one. Although the barrel, with its monumental length of 71 calibers, was identical to the towed version, the breech mechanism had to be redesigned to fit into the cramped fighting compartment. Consequently, engineers utilised the horizontal sliding block breech from the smaller 75mm PaK 40 gun. To prevent the titanic recoil forces, generated by firing projectiles weighing nearly 10 kilograms, from transferring directly onto the overloaded chassis, designers installed a special recuperator above the barrel and placed balancing cylinders on the sides, a configuration that gave the weapon its characteristic jagged appearance. This technical improvisation officially received a new identity on the 27th of January in the year 1944, when a bureaucratic decree replaced the previous name, Hornis, meaning hornet, with Nashorn, or Rhinoceros. This name change was not without a certain unintentional irony. While a hornet evokes an aggressive and swift insect, a rhinoceros suggests a massive, thick-skinned beast. This stood in total contradiction to the vehicle's paper-thin armour, which was a far cry from a thick skin. Nevertheless, the name stuck, becoming synonymous with a weapon that could deal blows like few others, yet was as fragile as an eggshell when receiving them. However, the greatest peril for the crew was neither the name nor the hastily patched-together chassis, but the ammunition storage, which turned the vehicle into a potential ticking time bomb. The 40 shells of the combat load were stowed in open racks directly against the side walls of the fighting compartment, just centimetres from the loaders' heads, and separated from enemy fire by nothing more than a thin sheet of steel. A single incandescent splinter piercing the wall was often enough to ignite the propellant charges, destroying the entire vehicle in a catastrophic explosion before the driver could even engage the reverse gear. The primary armament, the 88mm PaK 43/1, was undoubtedly the dominant feature of this architecture, endowing the vehicle with a firepower capable, in theory, of vaporizing any enemy armoured unit on the battlefield. With a muzzle velocity of the armour-piercing shell exceeding 1,000 meters per second, this gun could still punch through 132mm of sloped steel at a distance of 2,000 meters. In practice, this meant that even the most massive Soviet or Allied tanks could be engaged from a range where the Nashorn appeared to the enemy as nothing more than a tiny, insignificant speck on the horizon. The optics, a high-precision gunner's sight, allowed the shooter to fully exploit these exceptional ballistic properties, but this absolute offensive potency stood in grotesque disproportion to the defensive fragility of the carrier vehicle. While the cannon was capable of slicing through steel as if it were butter, the superstructure of the self-propelled mount offered little more protection than a simple tin box, as the armour plates measured a mere 30mm at the front and dropped to only 10mm on the flanks. This derisory skin of metal was not even intended to stop a direct hit, but served solely to shield the 5 crew members from light infantry weapons or stray splinters, a protection that, in the brutal reality of an engagement, often proved completely insufficient. Even more fatally, the design of the fighting compartment, entirely open at the top and rear, left the soldiers extremely vulnerable to mortar fire, artillery fragments, or even hand grenades, which could be tossed over the sides during close-quarters combat. Added to this fragility were the monumental physical dimensions of the vehicle, which with a total height of 2 meters and 94 centimeters, towered over almost all other German armoured vehicles of the era, turning it into an ideal target for enemy gunners. This colossal silhouette was the result of the necessity to install the massive breech block and recoil mechanism above the engine, which shifted the centre of gravity dangerously upward, making the machine unstable and prone to pitching on uneven terrain. The Nashorn was thus a living technical paradox. It carried a weapon designed for long-range duels, yet it possessed the profile of a barn door, making any attempt at camouflage in the flat steppe or open country a near impossible task for its occupants. Mobility also suffered from this unequal distribution of mass and the chronic overloading of the chassis, as the Maybach engine, while allowing for acceptable road speeds, frequently reached its thermal tolerance limits off-road. The fine slats of the lateral air intakes, which led directly to the fighting compartment, did not just suck in cooling air. In the heat of battle, they also engulfed clouds of gunpowder smoke and dust, further degrading the working conditions of the loaders and prematurely wearing down an already sensitive mechanical system. It was a machine that placed its crew before an impossible choice. To utilize the crushing range of the gun, they had to expose themselves, but the slightest detection meant certain destruction due to the total absence of real armor. Unlike the heavily armored assault guns that operated in the furnace of the front lines to absorb enemy punishment, the Nashorn had to be employed strictly as a long-range precision instrument. Any attempt to support infantry at close quarters or to storm urban centres would have been an immediate death sentence for the vehicle and its 5 occupants, given that the open casemate architecture condemned them at the slightest retaliation. The doctrine of engagement, which became an absolute condition for survival, dictated that enemy targets should only be engaged from a distance of 2,000 to 2,500 metres. This safety margin allowed the Nashorn to sublimate the phenomenal reach and surgical clarity of its optics, while remaining just outside the effective range of most standard enemy tank guns. This tactical asymmetry transformed the crews into patient predators, capable of lying in ambush for hours before delivering devastating blows in a matter of seconds, only to vanish immediately after. Since this nearly 3-metre-high silhouette was virtually impossible to conceal in flat terrain, the success of every mission depended critically on the integration of a specialised observation and liaison section. This unit served as the eyes of the entire battalion, spotting targets long before the self-propelled gunners established direct visual contact. These heavy army tank hunter battalions, which operated with total autonomy from regular armoured divisions, were deployed as mobile fire brigades by army staffs to the most critical breakthrough points of the front. There, their mission was to shatter concentrated Soviet armoured wedges from a distance. Internal coordination within these units relied on high-power radio equipment, allowing the fire of an entire company of 14 vehicles to be concentrated on a single target zone, creating an apocalyptic saturation effect. However, this theory of the stalking hunt was violently contradicted by the technical reality of the machine. As soon as the monumental gun opened fire, the blinding muzzle flash and the gigantic cloud of dust, kicked up by the pressure of the propellant charge, instantly betrayed the shooter's position. An immediate change of position after only a few shots was therefore a vital necessity. Yet the chronically overloaded chassis and the thermal whims of the engine often turned these rapid manoeuvres into a deadly game of chance. A simple mechanical failure at the wrong moment meant annihilation. Thus, while the concept of long-range combat sounded brilliant on paper, it collided head-on with the brutal reality of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1943, as the first units ventured into the vastness of the Russian steppes. The baptism of fire for the 560th Heavy Tank Hunter Battalion during Operation Citadel in the summer of 1943 immediately revealed the precarious nature of this weapon system. Although the unit was theoretically considered an elite formation intended to support Army Detachment Kempf, the technical unreliability of its mounts prevented any cohesive deployment. Instead of forming the spearhead of the attack, which, given the absence of armour, would have been tantamount to a suicide mission, the vehicles were relegated to protecting the flanks of the 3rd Panzer Corps. There, in the vastness of the plains south of Kursk, they could finally exploit their lethal reach against distant Soviet anti-tank screens and reserves in the midst of deployment. While the ballistic superiority of the gun was confirmed, the extreme conditions of the Russian summer transformed the open fighting compartment into a suffocating furnace of dust, pushing the physical endurance of the loaders to their absolute limits. 1 year later, during the massive Soviet offensive known as Operation Bagration, the situation became even more dramatic. The Wehrmacht was collapsing under the steamroller of the Red Army, and the 519th Battalion had to intervene urgently near Vitebsk as a mobile fire brigade against overwhelming numerical superiority. In the fierce rearguard actions between the 22nd and the 30th of June in the year 1944, the Nashorns of this unit achieved the feat of destroying 112 Soviet tanks. This statistical anomaly was based, however, less on the intrinsic quality of the vehicle than on the desperation and excellence of the German gunners. Yet even this impressive tally of kills could not halt the collapse of the front. During the retreat, the bulky vehicles, due to lack of fuel or minor mechanical breakdowns, often had to be sabotaged and abandoned on the roadside. The appearance of the Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks changed the rules of the game on the battlefield once again, with the Nashorn being one of the few German machines capable of piercing their massive frontal armour at a range of over 2,000 metres. These duels resembled a dance on a razor's edge. While the 88mm cannon had to place shots with surgical precision, it took only a single high-explosive shell from the Soviet tanks detonating near the open self-propelled gun to put the crew out of action through the sheer effect of the blast wave and splinters. In winter, the design flaw of the open structure reached its paroxysm. Without heating or shelter, the men were surrendered defenceless to the glacial temperatures, which reduced the operational capacity of the human component far faster than enemy fire. The fate of battalions 93 and 655, engaged in pockets of resistance in Ukraine and later in Romania, ended almost systematically with the total loss of equipment. These massive machines were entirely unsuitable for hurried retreats across dilapidated bridges or mud-clogged roads. While in the east the burnt-out carcasses of Nashorns lined the withdrawal routes and the Red Army pushed inexorably toward the west, a new chapter of horror opened for the remaining units. The Allied landings in Italy, and later in Normandy, confronted these lumbering colossi with terrain and aerial domination for which they had never been designed. The deployment of the 525th Heavy Tank Hunter Battalion to the Italian theatre of operations marked the beginning of a logistical and tactical nightmare that mercilessly exposed the Nashorn's structural flaws. In the rugged mountain ranges of the Apennines and along the narrow winding serpentines around Monte Cassino, this nearly 3-metre-high, underpowered colossus acted as a foreign body. Its high centre of gravity and a restricted horizontal gun traverse, a mere 15 degrees to either side, made tracking targets across extreme elevation changes nearly impossible. While Allied forces flexibly deployed their agile Sherman tanks and tank destroyers, German crews were forced to park their lumbering machines like stationary bunkers in valleys, where the open-topped fighting compartment turned them into easy targets for mortar fire and constant raids by Allied fighter bombers, against which the Nashorn possessed absolutely no defensive measures. Despite these hostile circumstances and the fact that the Italian landscape rarely offered the vital firing distances of over 2,000 metres, the 88mm cannon remained a deadly threat as long as it maintained the advantage of the first shot. This was dramatically demonstrated during the final phase of the conflict on the Western Front, when remnants of the 93rd Battalion operated in the ruins of the Rhine industrial area. On the 6th of March in the year 1945, in the town of Niel, north of Cologne, a historically remarkable confrontation occurred that symbolically summarises the Nashorn's entire existence. An obsolete improvised chassis clashed with the modern pride of the American arms industry, the Merschelou-Pershing heavy tank, which was then considered invincible. In this lopsided duel, the Nashorn lurked in a perfectly camouflaged ambush position among the rubble and opened fire at an unusually short distance for this weapon system, less than 500 metres. The result was devastating and proved the brutal efficiency of German ballistics one last time. The Model 43 armour-piercing shell effortlessly punched through the massive lower frontal hull of the American heavyweight, entered the interior, and caused an explosion of the ammunition stores, instantly turning the Pershing into a blazing wreck. However, this tactical success was but a brief flash in a fight lost long ago, as immediately after firing, the Nashorn was forced to abandon its position, often ending up sabotaged by its own crew due to fuel shortages or broken tracks before it could fall into enemy hands. The end of these weapon systems in the Ruhr pocket and in the final battles in the heart of Germany was characterised by total material exhaustion, as spare parts for the exotic mix of components from Panzer III and IV tanks were no longer available, while factories lay in ruins. The few remaining vehicles that were not pulverised by enemy anti-tank fire mostly succumbed to mechanical failure, left standing by the roadsides as rusted monuments to a botched armament policy. It is an irony of history that out of nearly 500 units produced, Once intended as the mobile answer to the Soviet tank flood, only 2 specimens eventually survived the passage of time to testify to their bizarre existence in 2 completely different worlds. The first of the 2 surviving vehicles, which was transported to the United States of America after the cessation of hostilities, rotted for nearly 50 years under the open sky, serving today as almost forensic evidence of the critical shortage of raw materials in the late war years. Corrosion has gnawed deep into the steel plates, scarcely a few millimeters thick, revealing the inferior alloys that had to be utilised in the absence of rare metals. Meanwhile, the interior, despite massive weathering, still documents the ergonomic catastrophe in which 5 crew members had to operate, huddled in a cramped space between glowing shell casings and gasoline fumes. In contrast, the second specimen survives in the closed, dusty halls of Kubinka in Russia, where missing small parts and a historically incorrect, coarse coat of paint certainly obscure the machine's original identity. Yet beneath the thick layer of dust, the feverish improvisation remains visible in every crude weld and every makeshift bolt. These physical remnants lead to a sobering final assessment of a weapon system that is often erroneously glorified as a technical masterpiece, when in truth it represented an absolute design failure born of sheer desperation. To be sure, the Nashorn was relatively cheap to produce and quickly available.